Americans, my friends, I know you're out there. It's been a while since I've made a video especially for you, but this is a big one. So did you know that some of our clients who are US citizens and do not renounce are legally paying zero tax offshore? You want to join the club? You want to see if you can join the club? Then stay tuned. Hello everyone, this is Javier Carrera, Research and Development Associate with Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7 and 8 figure entrepreneurs go where they're treated best. And yes, that also obviously includes Americans, US citizens, some of the most wonderful clients we've had here at Nomad Capitalist, and some of the individuals with the most complex tax cases. So let's do a quick overview before we dive into the topic. So obviously, in the United States, you have this very particular situation whereby you are considered a U.S. person for tax purposes just by being a citizen. So basically, if you're a U.S. citizen, if you're a green card holder, then essentially you are a U.S. tax person regardless of where you live, meaning that if you are a U.S. citizen, you have your U.S. passport and you travel around the world, as long as you are a citizen of the United States, then you are liable for tax in the U.S. and you have to comply with all regulations regarding to tax in the United States of America. Well, it has become increasingly difficult for Americans to hit that zero tax mark. We have helped many Americans substantially reduce their taxes by going overseas. However, there are still a handful of cases where we have been able to help clients reach 0% tax, even if they do not renounce their U.S. citizenship. And today I want to shed a bit of light into some of those cases by talking about some of my experience with a handful of U.S. clients that have achieved this status, how we did it, exactly what method did we follow, and understanding that while it does not apply for everyone, it might apply to you. And if you're in this situation, do consider reaching out to Nomad Capitalist, because working with somebody who knows the tax code, who knows about these things, and who can properly guide you into this very particular niche, this very particular exception that might apply to you, could change your life. So let's dive right into it. So first scenario I want to go through is I have a client, let's call him Bob, right? Really nice guy. Bob, he was a consultant. He was in the tech sector. He was a great guy with computers. He did a ton of stuff I did never understand with computers. Did some programming. He had some very high profile clients in the US and all over the world. And so we're talking to Bob and we're discussing the possibility of going offshore, etc. And then he tells us, well, you know what? My business partner happens to be Canadian. And I say, okay, perfect. And then what we went into is saying, well, your partner is Canadian. He is not a permanent resident of the US. And we went on to basically inquire how much time that Canadian partner had spent in the US. And we realized that basically that Canadian partner at that time had a non-immigrant visa. More specifically, that Canadian partner had an E2 visa with which he was living in the US. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, an E2 visa is a non-immigrant investor visa, which is essentially a visa that allows you to come to the US for business purposes. You can stay up to 2 years at a time. But as you are a non-immigrant, the only way you become a US person for tax purposes is if you go over what we call the substantial presence test, meaning you have to meet a number of days as a non-immigrant in the US to be considered a US person for tax purposes. Now, the beauty of those people who essentially qualify as US tax persons under this scenario is that by simply exiting the US the following year and spending less than 31 days in the US and simply making sure that their days count overall complies and does not meet the minimum requirement of the substantial presence test, then you essentially cease to be a US person for tax purposes. There is no exit tax. There is no other consequence whatsoever with somebody who just comes in and out of the US under those circumstances. Let's go back to our scenario. We have Bob, US citizen, business partner, a Canadian, who at the time had an E2 visa and was a US person for tax purposes under the substantial presence test. We simply noticed that if both partners were willing to go offshore, the partner, who was Canadian, left the US, no tax consequence, no exit tax, nothing. He became, again, a non-resident alien for tax purposes in the US. And then Bob also exited the US without renouncing his US citizenship. They were going to start a new business venture, so this was, again, a very ideal scenario in which no assets had to be transferred out of the US. This was simply a new startup that was going to come into existence. So once both these partners were outside the US, we set up an offshore company in a jurisdiction that was very tax favorable. And we spoke to them, and luckily they were under the scenario in which both of them had contributed equal capital to the business, and both of them were going to be 50-50 shareholders. Now, what does this mean? As the Canadian partner owned 50% of the business, essentially the corporation, the foreign corporation in question, was not, and this is the big thing, was not a controlled foreign corporation for US tax purposes under US law. This means that Bob, as a US citizen, just now essentially avoided US Subpart F tax inclusions, and he also avoided GILTI tax in the United States, which are two of the most complicated things to avoid, especially GILTI. Subpart F, easier to work around. GILTI, really terrible, difficult to work around. But by simply avoiding those two potential inclusions in the United States, this opened the possibility for Bob to retain earnings inside of the foreign corporation without any major tax consequences in the US. Once that had been established, then we just had to look into whether Bob could have been exposed to some kind of PFIC taxation, which is kind of like a higher rate of tax that is imposed on corporations when they distribute dividends, essentially coming from passive income that is not part of a Subpart F inclusion. Now, I know this is getting a bit technical, so I hope you follow me around. So we've avoided Subpart F, we've avoided GILTI by having the Canadian partner own 50% of the business, and now we only have to worry about Bob getting a potential higher rate under PFIC rules. But luckily, in this case, this was an active trader business. This was not a company that was for investment purposes. They were not holding shares. They were not buying bonds. They were legitimately providing a service to third-party customers. As an active business, we didn't have to worry about any type of PFIC consequences in the United States. As a consequence of this overall, what did we get? We have a tax-free foreign corporation. We have a Canadian who is a non-resident of Canada for tax purposes and therefore not subject to Canadian tax rules, including CFC rules and including overall taxation in Canada. And we have a US shareholder who is a stockholder of a non-controlled US foreign corporation, which means that the American in question, Bob, is able to retain earnings in the company indefinitely, essentially, at zero tax. And as the director of the company, he was able to take out a salary. So what did we do? We matched his salary to the foreign earned income exclusion, and therefore Bob could earn a tax-free salary working as the director of his own company. And in addition to that, the other cool thing is Bob decided to build himself a trifecta method with Nomad Capitalist's help. So where is he spending time? He's spending time in Bogota, Colombia. He's spending time in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He's spending time in all of these great places around the world where, guess what? A $10,000 a month salary that barely gets you by in Miami or San Francisco makes him live like a king in one of these places. So not only is he getting tax-free corporate profits, a tax-free salary, but he's also living in locations where cost of living is so low that his salary goes 10 times further than it would in, again, a New York, a Houston, a Miami, or a San Francisco. On top of that, the other thing that we also put into place was different types of shares inside the company, so as to allow the Canadian partner to potentially take out dividends without forcing Bob to also take out dividends. Now, this can get a bit technical, so I don't want to dive too deep into those details, but just to let you know, Nomad Capitalist can help you with these kinds of things. Corporations have multiple types of shares, and if you have business partners that are concerned about having you as a U.S. shareholder in the business because you obviously will want to avoid those dividend taxes, then we can structure things properly in a way that your partners can take out dividends without having to force you as a US person to take out dividends. So all of this, very good so far. And in addition to all of this, we managed to get these gentlemen to form a corporation in a jurisdiction that has a tax treaty with the United States. And what does this mean? This means that these dividends that Bob may potentially take out in the future, he hasn't taken out any that I know of so far, would be taxed at qualified dividend rates. So not only is he getting, again, a tax-free salary, tax-free corporate profits, but he is also being able to take out dividends when he needs to at preferential rates, rates that can go from 15 to around 20%, which is much more favorable than the ordinary dividend rates that normally apply to other corporations that that are incorporated in places that don't have tax treaties with the US. So overall, as you can see, a very favorable picture for Bob in this case. The second case scenario I want to run by you, the case scenario of a client, a very talented and beautiful young woman that I had the opportunity to work with here at Nomad Capitalist. Let's call her Mary. And so Mary was a US citizen and she was working on a fashion design label. And it was a big thing, fashion. She wanted to sell her products all over the world. And she was a very, I would say, rare client for Nomad in that she really wanted and needed to build a business that was important in terms of on-the-ground operations. She needed warehouses, she needed equipment, she needed a factory for all of the clothes that she was going to make, and she was going to hire a ton of workers, etc. So what did we do? In this case, we didn't have a foreign partner that could take up 50% of the business in terms of ownership to avoid CFC rules. So what we did was look at how we could, first of all, avoid subpart F income inclusion, and then how we could minimize GILTI. So what we did, number one, was check if she was somehow exposed to any kind of subpart F income inclusions. And luckily she was not, because this was an active business that she was going to run overseas, by the way, in a country where, again, cost of living is lower, cost of production is lower. So that was already a big positive thing. When she decided to move her operations from the US to this other country, that already meant significant savings for Mary. Now, when Mary started explaining how her business would work, we quickly noticed that she wouldn't have to worry about subpart F. This was legitimately a active business, and on top of that, it was a business that was essentially trading with legitimate, unrelated third parties all over the world, so nothing to worry about in terms of subpart F inclusion. That obviously have things like the personal holding company inclusion and the foreign sales company inclusion, things of that nature. So we're good so far. Then we had to worry about GILTI. So obviously, since Mary was the 100% owner of the company and she was or is a US citizen, then we obviously did have to worry about GILTI inclusions and worry about them a lot. Now, the good thing here is that we managed to tell Mary that we had some pretty good news. This means that if you have, for example, $1 million worth of qualified business assets, again, assets that can qualify as depreciable assets under Section 167 of the Internal Revenue Code, inside your foreign business, you can essentially take 10% of the value of those assets and exclude that from GILTI taxation. So let's run a simple mathematical example. If you have $1 million worth of hard assets, that means you can have $100,000 excluded in terms of income from GILTI taxation. Now, Mary, being a successful young woman, having secured a lot of funding and financing, she was going to make a tremendous investment into her business, something in the tens of millions, which gave her a sizable GILTI exclusion. So we found ourselves in the scenario where, at least for the first couple of years, because do keep in mind, as assets depreciate, the exclusion does go down gradually over time, but at least for the first couple of years, the exclusion actually surpassed Mary's revenue projections, which means that Mary was in this very peculiar situation where she kept her US citizenship, she owned 100% of her foreign company, but her foreign company was both able to avoid subpart F income inclusions and GILTI income inclusions. Now, in addition to this, we also did protect Mary. We established a US holding company for her foreign business, which gives her a ton of other benefits, which she will really see 5 or 7 years down the line when that depreciation really starts accelerating and when there's no more big exclusions to be held from GILTI. But these are two great examples of two American citizens, two American citizen clients that Nomad has had, clients that we have been able to help relocate overseas, enjoy lower cost of living, as stated before, and operate businesses overseas in a very tax optimal manner without renouncing their US citizenship. So while it is more difficult, it is still possible. Do not lose hope. I know many people find it difficult to renounce US citizenship. And trust me, I understand you. If I were a US citizen, if I were in your shoes, I'd have doubts too. The US is your country. In some cases, the US is your homeland. It's a place where you were born. It's a place where you grew up in. You might want to come back for personal or business reasons. And sometimes if you renounce your US citizenship, you don't have a clear path to go back. Not all of us can qualify for a European passport by descent. And even if we do, there are some provisions in the law that, you have to be mindful of if you want to come back. So keeping your US citizenship is important for many of you. And I think it's refreshing to see that by working with somebody like Nomad Capitalist, you are under the right circumstances, and if you meet the right variables, then it might be potentially possible to keep your US citizenship, keep your US passport, and still pay zero tax overseas. Now, even if you don't manage to be in the zero category group, know that Nomad Capitalist has helped hundreds, if not thousands of Americans go overseas, reduce their taxes legally. And even if they don't hit zero, they do reduce their taxes dramatically. So if you're wondering if you're one of those Americans that can qualify for the zero tax mark and the zero tax group, or if you simply want to dramatically reduce your taxes and your cost of living by going offshore, then be sure to go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply, subscribe to this YouTube channel for more handy tips, and follow us on Instagram. And I'll see you guys in the next video.